When you talk about metals selling off along with everything else, look, they have in the past when there has been a market collapse, like we saw in March as an example of 2020, metal sold off with it. When we saw the great financial crisis in 2008, metal sold off with it. Now, the popular or the conventional wisdom is that this is the baby being thrown out with the bathwater to meet margin call requirements. And I have always kind of wondered if that was really the case or that was more cartel management, if you will, kind of damage control. The worst thing that you could see happening in conjunction with a massive market sell-off and chaos, panic and fear would be gold and silver accentuating themselves the way one might think they would in that environment. But by the same token, it's interesting because one would think that gold and silver represent the safety from that event. And the last few market sell-offs that we've seen of any significance have shown us that indeed gold and silver is being sold off, but often turns right around and goes right back up. In the case of 2008, it fell and then over the next ensuing 3 years reached its all-time high in 2011 up to that point of, almost $2,000 gold and $50 silver. If we look at what happened in March when, silver fell all the way off to $11 an ounce, it tripled in a matter of just a few months after that. So whether or not we see this sell-off is debatable. Whether or not it truly is people throwing out the baby with the bathwater to meet margin requirements is debatable, or whether or not it is the cartel doing damage control is debatable. All of these things certainly are debatable, but we are entering a period of time where I think, ignoring that possibility of it being sold off or cost averaging your position into that environment would be a better way than waiting for that environment and hoping that you are able to cherry pick a bottom. Now, look, there's a very strong possibility that event may mark the bottom of the sell-off in metals. It very well may. It has in the past. But by the same token, I don't know that that's really a wise thing to do this time. When you look at the positioning right now of the commercial banks, which have really been positioning for a rise in the metals, at least in terms of where they are on COMEX, when you look at the massive drawdown in physical metal that we've seen off of the world's exchanges and the backdooring out of the world's ETFs by the authorized participants, it would signal as though that the big money is preparing for said event and is positioning themselves in the world bullion markets for this type of an event. So, there's a lot of confusion these days, Dunnigan, and I think the moral of the story is trying to outsmart the markets probably isn't going to work. You might get lucky if you do, but I think instead people who are uncertain about how this all plays out, rather than waiting for this moment and hoping that things play to a certain script or a narrative, I think is probably not the best idea right now, especially based upon the positioning of the big money and the drawdown of physical metal, but rather to cost average a position. If you're thinking of adding money right now, maybe break it up into 2 or 3 tranches and cost average your position over the next 30 days or so and see what happens. See if the public on this side of the ledger who is expecting this event, see if it happens. See if gold and silver do sell off. If it does, you'll have some dry powder. If it doesn't, and the commercial banks are positioned correctly, and the people who have been drawing down from the exchanges have been doing this to get into position in a proactive fashion, maybe they're right, because one of these times they will be right. So rather than betting your whole stack of chips, if you will, on one outcome, cost averaging and mitigating, if you will, the risk and the uncertainty is probably a good way to play this right now. I think it's probably better than betting on one side or the other. I've always had a hard time believing in the concept of Nasara and Jasara. I know a lot of people are very, very adamant about this being a possibility. And I guess it's important to take a step back and realize that, everyone, that someone's debt is someone else's asset. And not everyone who has assets is a bad guy. Imagine that you scraped and worked your whole life to own an apartment building, 10-unit apartment building that represents your life's work, and now you're just going to be screwed, I guess you could say, for lack of a better explanation, if all debt is forgiven. And no, I don't think that'll really happen. I do think that the narrative of the banks being gone is a possibility. Why? Well, look, as extreme as that really sounds, you got the second in charge at the Fed. I think her name is Lael Brainerd, and her whole premise, I thought she was going to win the seat for the Federal Reserve, but Powell was reelected, and she was, I believe, put in as vice chair. Her whole premise, her whole thesis that she wrote a paper on was about removal of the commercial banks and dealing directly with the central bank, the Fed, a Fed coin, removal of cash, a cashless society where a monetary policy would then be stripped from the commercial banks and given to the Federal Reserve so that they could enact monetary policy directly to the public through their smartphone. Is that a possibility? Sure. When this all breaks apart, why not? I mean, if she was running on that platform for the Fed seat, why is that not a possibility? When they tell us that they've been working on central bank digital currency technology for quite some time, when you see it beginning to accentuate itself in China with the digital yuan. So some of these outcomes certainly could come together, but I think, the idea of all personal debt being wiped away, I think is not a good way to base your future decisions on, not a good plan to base your future decisions on. But, what, could you see a massive collapse in the dollar and interest rates spiking and the markets really break down and collapse? Could you see debt forgiveness on a big level with governments forgiving one another? I guess it's a possibility. I just have a hard time believing it in that, debt is one thing, but someone's debt is someone else's asset. And that's the important thing to take away from it. All of these things have been bantered around for quite some time. And I think it would be a mistake to base your future, if you will, upon these types of decisions. There's a part of me, the cynic in me, believes that most of it won't come to fruition. However, a lot of the things on the periphery may, like a central bank digital currency, like ultimately maybe they do get rid of the commercial banks so that the Fed can enact monetary policy to the public. Maybe they do start to move away from cash and start to slowly move to a cashless society. Yeah, these are all things that I think are possible. And I was talking about that in March of 2020 when Nancy Pelosi came out in her subcommittee House Finance bill and said viruses can live on paper currency. That to me was Pandora's box being open. That to me was, we're moving in that direction. Little by little, they drop breadcrumbs. But look, I think you hope for the best, you prepare for the worst. And a lot of these things that you see talked about in a fringe narrative, maybe they will come to pass. But I think you can't base your decisions in such a very high stakes game based upon fringe maybes, rather than, I think, if it happens, great. If not, you still are moving to protect yourself and your family in an orderly fashion based upon the information that is right in front of us right now. You can't sit and be paralyzed with uncertainty and fear based upon the what if. You have to, I think, make your decisions based upon the what is and what you have directly in front of you. And so, I mean, granted, the world is changing. This is something that I've been talking about for a very long time with you. I see a pattern of change, and it's not emanating as much from the white hats, as people would like to call them, or the good guys trying to, level the playing field.